We'll begin this part by admiring this pair of spur gears. These are in the association's relatively new metric range, Mod 0.3, that's the finer of the two, but somewhat coarser than the old 100 DP Imperial gears. Now, Nigel's kit originated at least 10 years before the association started selling these gears, but it could have been designed for them because these two are a perfect fit on the axle holes. These gears, by the way, are made in Poland for the association by KK Produkcja, if I pronounced that correctly. And the 16-tooth spur gear is going to go on the idler axle and a 25-tooth on the rear driven axle, and they should mesh nicely together. Now, along with these spur gears, we're also going to need a worm gear and worm wheel. And unfortunately, at this moment in time, there's a problem with the supply of metric worm sets through the association. So I'm going to have to use some old stock that I've got in my modelling box. And this is a 100 DP Imperial worm gear set made by Ultrascale for the association some time ago. And the 16-tooth spur gear and the 30-tooth worm gear are going to have to get mounted together on the same axle. And this is where the snag is with mixing and matching between metric and imperial gears, because the holes up the middle are not the same. The imperial one is 1/8 of an inch or 3.2 millimeters, and the metric one is 3 millimeters. So I have to use this special muff to mount them on, which is thicker on one side of the flange than it is on the other side. The 1/8 side is the long side, so that the imperial worm gear can go in the middle. And then we're going to mount the 16-tooth spur gear on the short side. But before we can think about putting these gears onto the muff, we've got one or two preparatory tasks to do. First, we're going to need some half axles. These are made exactly like the ones for the tender pivot. In fact, I made these as extras when I made the tender pivot ones. We're going to have to prepare the muff by cutting it to length, but we're also going to have to inspect and possibly clean the teeth of the gears. Now, I don't know how well you'll be able to see this, but there is a problem which affects particularly the metric gears because of the way they're made, and that is on the edges of the teeth there's often a little raised burr where they've been turned to size. And I'm just stroking the end of my tweezers, my very fine tweezers along here, and I can feel them catching on that burr. And it's very important, if there is one there, that it gets removed. Either file it or polish it away, because if there's a burr on the corner of the teeth, it's going to lead to very poor meshing, and we'll have a very poor running chassis as a result. So I'll just wave this around, try and catch it in the light, see if you can see those burrs. You can see the ones on the bottom there. So there are a couple of ways we can tackle this problem, and one possible way is to use wet and dry paper to polish the burrs away. I've folded over a small piece of 800 grit, which is sort of relatively fine, and folded up it just fits in between the teeth, and I can work my way round scrubbing away. And when that edge wears off, I can make a new fold. Now, you can count the teeth as you work your way round to make sure you've got them all, but probably easier is to get a marker pen and put a little black mark so you know where you started. And you can go round. The other way, and I think this is probably my preferred way now, is to actually try and carve off these burrs with the edge of a sharp scalpel blade. And what I'm doing here is I'm pushing the blade into the root between the teeth and sort of levering it against one tooth to scrape up the edge of the other tooth. This might take a little bit longer because each of these teeth has got 4 corners. So you've got to work your way round 4 times, twice in one direction, then turn it round twice in the other direction, doing one corner at a time. It's quite difficult to hold this in midair in front of the camera, but hopefully it's steady enough and focus enough for you to have seen some of those little chips coming off as I've gone round. So once I've got rid of the burrs on the teeth, I also need to get rid of the burrs on the inside hole. And in this instance, I'm going to go a bit further than I normally would to put a very small chamfer on that, and that's going to help this gear slide onto the muff and not try and sort of slice its way through the muff. I'll do this on both sides. and I'll do it on all 3 of the gears that have got to be mounted on the muffs. Small ones are particularly tricky to hold while you do this. I can't stress how important it is to make sure you've got rid of all the burrs on these gear teeth, and I strongly recommend that you get some strong magnification. I use a 10 times magnifying jeweler's loupe to really get in close and check round these teeth very methodically, because we want this chassis to be as smooth as it's possible to build it. So I'm just finishing chamfering off the worm wheel now, and once this is done we can turn our attention to preparing the muff. The first thing we need to do to the muff is to shorten it so that its length is a good running fit in between the bearings inside the frames. So I'm going to get my digital spanner and measure the width in between these bearing faces. Now it's tricky here because I don't want to push these bearings apart while I'm measuring them. So carefully does it, and that's 5.74 millimeters. And just double check with this muff and it should be 6 millimeters exactly. That's the way they're made. So I'm going to have to chop the muff down to about 5.65 or thereabouts. So we just want a good running clearance. We want to remove material from the long end of the muff so there's still room on the short end left for the gear to fit. And to hold it while I remove material, I'm going to put it in this fairly chunky pin vise. I got a set of 4 of these different sizes fairly recently. They're quite cheap and nasty, but for doing this kind of job, it's okay. It won't hold things exactly parallel like a collet would do, but I can hold it enough. And if I turn it slightly and roll it round as I file it, then even if it is a little bit wonky, I'm going to be filing evenly on all sides of this. So I'm not going to get a sort of sloping end to it, which I try to avoid. So having filed a little bit, I need to take it out and measure it and see how much I've filed off. If you notice, filing this Delrin, it kind of makes a sort of fluffy edge which you can sort of scratch away and polish off with your fingernail. It cuts really nicely. Normally I do this kind of thing by turning it in the lathe, turning the lathe round by hand and just with the graver paring off little bits. So let's see how far I've filed down there. 5.1. We've lost 0.1 of a millimetre. So I need to do that again 3 more times. So back into the pin chock, and I feel a bit more confident to press on a bit harder this time and rub a bit faster. So after all that, we're still at 5.8. We've got about halfway there now. I want to take this down to somewhere between 5.6, 5.65. So let's speed things up a bit. Take another 0.1 of a mil off, check. It's worth going slowly with this, because once you've overdone it, you've just got to throw the thing away and start again with another one. But finally we're there, just over 5.6, and don't trust the measurement. We need to check now between the frames. So we'll give it a trial fit. If I can get it in. Not got a very good grip on it with these tweezers. And there's just a tiny little bit of freedom of movement. So I think that's going to be fine. So now it's the right length. As we did with the muff on the tender, we need to put a little chamfer on the inside of these so that the half axles can enter nicely. Now, having mentioned earlier that when I file the ends of these muffs down, you get that kind of like fluffy, raggedy edge to the plastic. I want to polish it now, so I'm using a felt polishing mop in my Dremel to just go in first one end and then the other end, and with the very lightest of touch, while I'm twirling it round in one finger, I'm just touching that to the polishing mop just to smooth it off so that we get no friction when this is rotating against the inside of the bearing. Unfortunately, the polishing mop sheds hairs everywhere, and I forgot to move the chassis out of the way, so I've got a nice pile of hairs to sweep up. I don't want them gumming up the works. So after all that cleaning and filing and polishing and scraping, finally we are ready to put these things together. And I'm going to start with the worm wheel, because that's going to go in the middle and it's going to leave me something left to get hold of to put the spur gear on the other end with. So grasping them off by the short end, in the pin vise again, trying to keep this as vertical as I can, push it down into the muff. And obviously that's not going to push all the way to the middle, so we need something that we can push between, and the ends of the vice jaws are handy. So again, trying to keep this perpendicular to the gear, push it in and push it up to the flange, and that flange helps it stay in the right place and stay level. We can see that that's on there quite securely now. It's quite a hard push actually. So now we can turn this round in the pin vise. So undo and put in the slightly fatter end, and it probably won't fit now because it's now 3.2 instead of 3mm. So I'll open out the jaws a little bit and then we can tighten that one in, and this will be an easier push down onto the 16-tooth spur gear. And even though it looks like it's gone all the way, it hasn't quite. We're going to have to go back to the vise, just wind that out. And this will just squeeze on. Now this one, because it's on the end, doesn't feel quite so secure, and you can actually move it round with your fingers, but as soon as the half axle has gone inside, that will hold it tight again. It'll push out on the muff. So you can see that smooth rounded edge where I polished the edge of that muff there. So there we have it. And now one last operation is to drill the air release hole. Now we can't drill up the middle of the muff because the gear is in the way, so I'm going to drill diagonally from the side of the gear, and hopefully if I get the angle of this right, the inside of the hole should be nearer to the middle of the gear, and it will let the air escape as the half axles are pushed in. And having drilled into the centre of the axle hole, there might be little bits of swarf left from my air hole. So I'm putting a 1.4mm drill through there and just wriggling it round to get rid of any swarf. Now, if you remember what seemed like years ago, we filed a cutaway in this rear spacer to make room for the larger of the spur gears. So we need to remember when we put this gear in to get it the right way round. So the spur gear has to go to the left hand side of the chassis the way I've built it. And before I put in the half axles, I'm going to test it with this 1.4mm drill rod and just make sure that the gap between the frames is sufficient and this will spin freely, which it will, and I'm quite happy with that. And there you see the other spur gear is going to fit into that notch. Okay, so take away the drill and the moment of truth to put in the half axles. So you just drop in the first one from on top. That should go nicely into the chamfer. We want something robust, like the edge of an engineer's square, to come down and press that home. trying not to squash the chassis while I'm doing that. And I can push those in a bit further later on if I want to. Then turn it over, and same thing with the other half axle. Now, having seen this spin so freely before, once these axles are pressed in, the act of pressing them in will have squashed the frames a little bit. So if I test it now, I'll probably find that this is quite a tight fit. Now, there's no side play at all, and it doesn't rotate very freely. So what I can do to open that up is get some pliers, stick the jaws in, and sort of prise that chassis apart a little bit. Just the gentlest of tweaks. I don't want to distort the frames or break anything. Now, what I'd really like to do to get this running smoothly is to put it on the bench and run it up and down. But unfortunately, the gear doesn't protrude beyond the bottom of the chassis frames. So I need to get something else to run it backwards and forwards a few times with. So I've got this coffee stirrer here, and that will fit between the frames, and I can roll it like this just to loosen it up, or better still, put that on the mat and push the chassis backwards and forwards just to run this gear in its bearing and help it bed in. And there's absolutely no point going forward from here unless this axle is spinning freely, which with a bit of luck it should now be. Well, one thing to mention here is while you're messing about with this, make sure you don't catch these Simpson springs, because if you do, you can mangle them very, very easily. And now the chassis is painted, it'll be a pain if we have to start soldering new ones in. So I'm much happier with that now. It's spinning quite freely. You may be asking, why have I started with this geared axle? Well, the answer is, once the wheels have gone in, we won't be able to get at the stub axles here. But now we can move on and we can do the rear geared axle. And this is a metric gear and this is a metric muff. And quite why these metric muffs don't have flanges on, I don't know. I wish they did, because they're so useful, and hopefully in the future new ones will be produced with flanges. So this one's 3mm in diameter, and again we're going to have to measure the size it needs to be and cut it down to size and then mount the gear at one end. Now I've measured this gap and it's 0.1 of a millimetre narrower than the previous gap that we measured. So I'm going to have to file this muff down to 5.5mm. Now I mentioned already that these cheap and nasty pin vise set that I got aren't that great, especially compared to holding in a collet in a lathe. They don't hold them parallel. So what I'm doing here is I'm getting my 1.4mm drill and putting it down the centre of the muff so that I can see whether this is holding in line with the shank of the pin vise, so that as I file it, I'm filing it straight and not filing it wonky. I've managed to get this one alright, but you can sort of hold it with the drill bit in one hand while you tighten it up with the other hand to get it straight. I do have some very nice pin vices. I'm not anti-pin vice, but I needed to get these to hold these muffs. I needed one this big to prove that mere mortals, as well as watchmakers, lathe owners, can make a nice running chassis. So having just put that chamfer in the end with the big drill, I want to try and hold this up to the camera now so you can see the extent of the chamfer. This is what you should be aiming for. Not too big at all, just enough to help guide the half axle into that hole. And once I've chamfered the other end, it's on to give it a quick polish as well. And you really have to take light touches of this. If you dig in a bit hard, as I am about to do here, we'll see the consequences of this. I'll show you what it looks like. So hopefully you can see how that polisher has rounded off the outside edge as well as the inside edge, and as I rotate it you can see where the light's catching. There are one or two little flats where I've pushed this in to the polisher a bit too hard and it's taken off more plastic than I wanted it to. This doesn't matter in this instance because if I catch the light on the end, you'll see it's still got a flat, smooth ring. And it's really the smoothness of this that's going to help it rotate nicely, not the actual shape of it, because the flat edge is going to be rotating against the inside of the bearing. And now we can mount the 25 tooth gear on the axle exactly as before, only this time we're not going to go near the vise and push it down along the axle, we're going to leave it on the very edge. So let's try it for size. Put it into the chassis and get the 1.4mm drill bit. This is a running fit inside the muff, so we should be able to spin that gear around on it. So the moment of truth, give it a spin. And I'm really happy with that. That spins very freely indeed. So I'll show off with a close-up view. And you can see now the very tight clearance between the worm wheel and the idler gears. When I've stopped playing with it, I'll turn it round and show you an end-on view. I'm just indulging myself with how nicely that goes round. So this is why we don't want any play on these axles, because if they can move side to side with respect to each other, and this 25 tooth gear crash in with the 30 tooth worm wheel, then we'd have jams in the chassis. So as it moves, just a little bit of running clearance, and same on the other axle. And that I am happy with. So we've just got one small task left to do now before we can put the driving wheels in, and that's to take this axle out again and drill that little air release hole in the centre of it. Mustn't forget to do this. Just down into the middle, don't need to go all the way through, and again with the 1.4mm drill to clear out any swarf that might be sticking out from the hole and could cause a problem for the half axles of the driving wheels.